Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Dr. Peter Novodvorsky. He's an Honorary Clinical Lecturer at University of Sheffield in the UK. He's also a consultant diabetologist dealing with diabetes in Slovakia. And we're going to talk about the effects of hypoglycemia on the human body. Hypo meaning sugar is too low versus hyperglycemia. So, Peter, thanks for coming.
Oh, hello, Richard. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you and, in fact, to the others who are listening.
Yeah, just right off the bat, what are the physiological effects of hypo versus hyperglycemia, and which is more dangerous?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I would probably answer simply that both of them, the hyper, so the high glycemia, and the hypo, the low glycemia, are dangerous in different ways, but also the latest research has shown that there might even be some sort of common reasons why these two can be dangerous. So it's best to stay in normal glycemia, so the normal glucose levels, and either deviation up or down can be dangerous, really.
So why hypoglycemia? What are you studying about it? Are you hoping to mitigate it in people where they have less events where they go hypoglycemic, or like what's the reasoning?
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So I've been working closely with Ahmed Iqbal, who has given a nice podcast here, and he's mentioned a few things there. And we both worked in Sheffield in the United Kingdom with Simon Heller, one of the sort of leading expert in the hypoglycemia research. And my particular focus is on what the hypoglycemia does to your heart and to the cardiac rhythm, and in general the cardiovascular risk. That means the risk of people who have diabetes getting a cardiovascular disease.
Oh, well, okay. So if someone has cardiovascular disease, or I would guess other comorbidities of diabetes, what does that do? Does that put them into a more hypoglycemic state? Or does it make it easier for them to go into that state or not recover from it? Like, what's the implications?
Oh, yeah. So I would see it a bit differently then. Perhaps I will, give you a few sort of insights into the history. As you know, today, or, this year, we're celebrating the 100th year anniversary of discovering insulin. And since then, we've been also dealing with the problem of low sugar levels. These have been described by, Frederick Banting, James Collip, the guys who have in fact discovered insulin very early after discovery of insulin, that too much insulin perhaps, or, inadequate amount of insulin, in comparison to the amount of carbohydrates ingested, or say too much exercise can really drive your sugar too low. And that can be very unpleasant to the person who has the hypoglycemia, and also can be potentially dangerous in very many ways. And I'm very happy to discuss those further. But in general, the problem with hypoglycemia we have had since the very discovery of insulin, and we're still dealing with that in our daily practice.
All right. So what do people feel like when they go hypoglycemic? What's the common anecdote?
Yeah, so the common symptoms are so-called autonomic symptoms or neurogenic symptoms, and these result from the sort of activation of our sympathoadrenal response, or the release of adrenaline or noradrenaline, epinephrine or norepinephrine into the body. And these can be, say, for example, you feeling a bit shaky, tremulous, increased sweating, or increased hunger. But there are also some other so-called neuroglycopenic symptoms, which are potentially more dangerous because, as you will know, glucose is an obligatory fuel to your brain, and the brain just needs adequate amounts of glucose to function normally. So if you don't have it, if you have low sugar levels, the brain starts or stops functioning normally. So you can have a bit of disorientation, confusion, and in more severe cases, in fact, there can be seizures, coma, or even death.
Right. So what is hypoglycemia? I would think it's different slightly for everybody, but there's probably a range of blood sugar.
Indeed, you're right. There is a wide range, and this is one of the reasons why the definition of hypoglycemia has been evolving over the years. And as you rightly mentioned, so various people react differently to various levels of blood glucose, and these reactions can even change within the time. We know that people who have the so-called the type 1 diabetes, who need to inject their insulin from the very onset of their disease, are a bit more prone to hypoglycemia for various reasons, because they have impaired counter-regulatory mechanisms, impaired defense mechanisms against hypoglycemia. And if you do get few of these, then you're more prone to get another one. So there is a bit of a vicious circle there. So the hypoglycemia begets another hypoglycemia is perhaps the way how to describe that. So you're right, there is a variability in people and also in that particular person over time.
Is there a rebound mechanism in the body? You know, it's always trying to control blood sugar. So if you go too high sugar, is there an effect that'll pull it down? I mean, the insulin, but what else? And if you go very low, what's the body's effect? How does it try to fix it quickly?
Yeah. So, I mean, Ahmed Iqbal has mentioned this briefly, but just very briefly, the natural defense against hypoglycemia in a healthy person is that your pancreas stops producing insulin. And when that doesn't help, the second defense mechanism is that your pancreas starts producing another hormone called glucagon. And that has an opposite effect on glucose levels. So the glucagon effect on the liver and on the muscles is that you get release of glucose from the liver, and the glycemia goes up. And if this doesn't help, and then we have the ultimate defense mechanism, which is the sympathadrenal response. So adrenaline gets released, and this has a profound effect on various parts of the body. And the net effect is that the blood glucose levels go up. And in people with diabetes, in particular with type 1 diabetes, these defense mechanisms are sometimes or commonly non-existing, the first two. And the third mechanism, the sympathadrenal response, can get attenuated over time. So the response to the subsequent low sugar or hypoglycemia gets less pronounced, and that can be sometimes dangerous. We're talking about the impaired awareness of hypoglycemia.
Yeah. Again, in plain English, what happens when someone gets very low blood sugar? Do they get confused? Do they, does their heart speed up? Do they, get hot or cold, thirsty? What happens?
That's right. They can have various symptoms. They can get hot, cold, sweaty, shaky, tremulous. They can have impaired vision. And in terms of their heart, naturally, because the adrenaline kicks in, there is a tendency towards increased heart rate, so-called tachycardia. So increased heart rate. Yet though, the research we've done in Sheffield has shown that in some people, understandably not all, but in some people, prolonged hypoglycemia during the night might in fact cause the slowing of the heart rate, the so-called bradycardia, which can be dangerous in different ways. So now we're talking more about the effect on the heart. But in general, people can get various symptoms which are very unpleasant, and some of the most severe episodes can end up, in fact, very badly for the person involved.
So what are you trying to figure out? You're trying to figure out how to prevent it, or just how to mitigate these episodes, or what's your goal?
Yeah. So say if we were talking about, say, 20 years ago or so, we would only be talking about the detrimental effects of hypoglycemia in terms of those symptoms I mentioned. So those autonomic symptoms, these unpleasant symptoms of shakiness or hunger or sweating, and those of the increased confusion, the neuroglycopenic symptoms. But since then we moved on, and we know that hypoglycemia has got much more wider negative impact on human body, in particular on the cardiovascular system. And that's perhaps not so surprising because, as we've mentioned this before a few times, it leads to the activation of the sympathoadrenal system, or the adrenaline gets released, and this can happen at various conditions under stress circumstances. And too much stress for your body, understandably, is not good, and the defense mechanism can then turn against the body when it's too much of it there. Indeed.
So, what's the focus of your research into hypoglycemia? Are you looking at type 1, type 2? Are you looking at it during sleep, right before you eat or after you eat? Where are you hoping to intervene?
Yeah, so we've been looking at the hypoglycemia effect on the cardiac rhythm, on the heart. This comes from the fact that there is a so-called dead-in-bed syndrome, which sounds a bit scary, and indeed it is, which is a fortunately rare even, but well described, that people with type 1 diabetes who were otherwise young and healthy have been found dead in their beds on the following morning. And before that, there was no sign of any severe illness, hence the name. And this has been described in the early 90s in the UK. And since then, we have had other reports from other parts of the world, and so my mentor, Professor Heller, has researched into this. We have shown that the possible mechanism of these deaths could be indeed the hypoglycemia, which has then led to cardiac arrhythmias. When I joined the group, we designed a study where we were looking at the effects of so-called clinical hypoglycemia, so the one which occurs normally when the people carry on with their normal lives. And we put on people the blinded continuous glucose monitors and the Holter ECGs, and we were looking at what was happening during the hypoglycemia versus the normal glycemic levels. And what we found... What
did you observe?
We found a few interesting observations. So initially, we realized that the hypoglycemia frequency is actually far more frequent than you might have thought, or what the data did show before, because the data in the past used to rely on the fact that the people who were examined put down in their diaries that they had hypoglycemia when they felt it. But when you have the luxury of blinded continuous glucose monitor, you notice that there are very many hypoglycemic episodes, in particular during the night, who go unnoticed by those people. So that's what we found, is that the finding number one was that the hypoglycemia is far more common than you might have thought. And secondly, that we found that during this period, when we're looking at these people for 4 days and 4 nights, there was the majority of the nocturnal hypoglycemia went unnoticed, and approximately every other hypoglycemic event during the day went unnoticed. So that was the first major finding. We also found that the hypoglycemic episodes during the night are generally longer compared to those during the day. And thirdly, we also confirmed that hypoglycemia leads to so-called QT interval prolongation. That is the measure of how quickly the heart resets in terms of the electrical activity. And this QT prolongation is a dangerous thing, which can potentially lead to some disturbances of cardiac rhythm in general.
I've heard that until recently, insulin pumps were not interacting with CGMs, which seems to me kind of insane because, like every night you go to sleep, you may not wake up. The insulin pump could just pump you to death and you're finished,
Yeah, well, this is a potentially very dangerous thing, and therefore there are various regulations in place. You will know that there are also people who do a bit of a DIY in terms of their insulin pumps. But in general, we have this technology, which is lovely, wonderful, and very quickly evolving. And we have data which have shown that the insulin pumps and the CGM, and then the combination of those two together, in particular in a setting when the pump can react on the data from the CGM, can prevent hypoglycemia, can prevent nocturnal hypoglycemia.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And also can increase the so-called time in range, which is the time spent in the blood glucose range, which is sort of physiological or near physiological, between say 70 and 180 milligrams per deciliter. So we have the wonderful technology which helps us to tackle hypoglycemia. Yet though hypoglycemia is still present and will be for quite a long time, I guess.
So what would be the intervention when someone's sleeping to prevent them from having, hypoglycemia events?
Right, yeah. So there are some continuous glucose monitors, the CGMs, which you can set up to alert you. And that can be visual, that can be some sort of signal in terms of audio signal, ringing, vibration, which can then wake you up. And this works quite well for people also during the day. And that's those who have the so-called impaired awareness of hypoglycemia. That's people who genuinely can't feel when their hypos are commencing. So we have the technology to alert you when you're using the CGM via the Bluetooth. It can't be the flash glucose monitoring, or at least not the first generation of the flash glucose monitoring, which you needed to swipe to find out what your sugar levels were. But the classic CGM has been helpful a lot in this clinical problem.
So, besides waking someone up, why not have a insulin pump that also has a little bit of, sugar in it? So it can pump maybe tiny amounts of sugar. That'd be an interesting experiment if someone was sleeping and they were hooked up to an IV and it gave little pulses of sugar whenever they went into a hypoglycemic state. I wonder what that would do to their sleep.
It would be certainly interesting. And I think people have thought about that, but it is perhaps not so easy to do. And we have the so-called dual systems when the insulin pumps do not only infuse insulin, but they also infuse tiny amounts of glucagon. So there are some data on these which are promising, but the situation is a bit more complex than that, because there are too many factors that influence your risk of going hypo on that particular day or night. Like, for example, the amount of your meal, the timing of your meal, the content of your meal, the amount of physical activity, the type of physical activity you've been doing, and a few other things really. And they all go into a complex equation, and that kind of estimates your risk or predicts the risk of you going low or high. And we really need better insulins, I would say, almost, because the algorithms in the pumps are quite good, but we need insulins which react a bit faster. So these insulins which we're using are a bit slower compared to how our body works when everything's fine. So in healthy people, that's a major difference, and one of the major struggles for those pumps to work better.
Yeah, the different insulin, I heard there's fast acting, slow acting, etc. So yeah. When people have the different types, what's the reaction when they're, what's their blood sugar response? You wouldn't have when you're hypoglycemic, but which one of them predisposes people more towards a hypoglycemic response?
Very nice question. Thank you for that. Just to give you a bit of an insight into physiology. So in a healthy body, the insulin is produced in the so-called beta cells in the pancreas. And it's a very fine-tuned regulation, which occurs on a sort of almost second-to-second basis, at least a minute to minute. And this insulin gets released from the pancreas into the so-called portal vein. That's the vein which goes or leads the blood flows through the vein into the liver. And the liver takes up more than 50% of that insulin. That's the so-called first pass effect. So this insulin gets cleared quite quickly from the systemic circulation, say, for example. And we have a half time of insulin of approximately a couple of minutes. That doesn't mean that insulin stops working in a few minutes, but most of it is bound to the liver receptors. And this is completely different to what you have when you have somebody who has got diabetes and insulin-dependent diabetes, because as you know, we are infusing the insulin into a subcutaneous tissue or intravenously in some circumstances. And there's a completely different dynamic of this release of that insulin from the depot into the body, into the circulation. And that doesn't go into the liver. That goes into the systemic circulation first. So it's a complete different way of the way how the insulin perhaps works, or where it goes first and where it goes then. And so these are important differences which one needs to be aware of when you're trying to say design the systems or the insulins and everything to prevent hypoglycemia. In fact, hyperglycemia really.
Well, what can you tell about the various mixtures? If like when someone takes insulin, do they take a blended mixture of fast and slow acting, or do they take just all fast?
Yeah. So in general, we divide those insulins, as you will know, into those which are the so-called basal insulins, and these are insulins which are the long-acting insulins, and they are primarily designed to meet the needs of the so-called basal metabolism. That means the body needs the insulin anyway, even if you don't eat anything, and the metabolism needs to work properly, and without insulin, it's not possible. So that basal insulin injection, which usually happens once in a day or twice a day, usually at night, tries to mimic that sort of basal secretion of insulin, which our pancreas also does. And that type of insulin can also lead to a hypo, and some types of insulins are better than the others. And the other type of insulin is this so-called fast or quick-acting insulin, and that's the one you inject with your meals. And we have seen some great improvements in the design of these new insulins, so-called insulin analogs, where you have a bit of a modification of the insulin structure, and that leads to better properties in terms of how quickly the insulin works, how quickly it gets off the system, or say, for example, with the long-acting insulins, you need to have a very flat profile. That means that the insulin works pretty much constantly over time, say 24 or 36 hours. So there's generally the mixture of these two, and then sometimes these are also mixed together in a fixed ratio. That's the so-called premixed insulins, but these are not used so frequently these days, perhaps, as they were in the past.
But, clinically, is it better to have a mixture of different types, or has it not been studied enough? Different formulations,
Oh, absolutely. So we have, a couple of those, and one size doesn't fit all, as you will know. And one of the skills of a clinician, of a diabetologist, is to pick the right type of insulin and give the right type of insulin to the right person. But it's not so easy. As I mentioned, the people are, of different age, different, social background, different level of education, and then they also lead different types of lives. Some people might lead sedentary lifestyles, some people do a lot of sports, and these are all important factors which in fact determine what type of insulin treatment you get them. People with type 1 need it anyway. People with type 2, we have a bit of a wider variety of medications apart from insulin, and you just need to pick the one so that you achieve the best compensation or the best, glucose control, which also includes prevention of hypos.
I don't have a clinical diagnosis, and neither does my wife, but, we've tried CGMs for a while. Mm-hmm. And I noticed with her, like, she'll have, let's say if she had something she shouldn't have, like a soda, her sugar will go up real high, and then it'll crash down real low, and she'll be hypo. But mine will go high, and then it'll slowly come down. So our profiles look like completely different. Do you have any speculation as to what factors modulate, what your response profiles look like?
Yeah, okay. Well, you both don't have the clinical diagnosis, diabetes, yet though, the reaction to some kind of a sugary meal is a bit different. So in your wife, there might be an element of what we call a reactive hypoglycemia. Okay, so if you ingest some carbohydrates, then your body might a bit, overact a bit if you want, and that might lead to this kind of an overshoot, hypoglycemia, which is usually can be sometimes a bit unpleasant to those people who experience that. But I would probably say that in your wife's case, there's a bit of this kind of hypoglycemia happening. And in your case, even in every healthy person, the level of blood glucose, so the glycemia, goes up after the ingestion of a meal. I mean, the ingestion of a meal which contains sugar, saccharides. So this is entirely normal. Now, in order to assess whether that CGM curve is completely normal or whether there is a bit of a pre-diabetes going on, I would need to see those, the levels of the sugar or the CG, the interstitial glucose you have recorded. But it's entirely possible that everybody's a bit different, and therefore the blood sugar profiles are a bit different.
Well, okay, so I know everyone's different, the profiles are different, etc. But are there a couple of archetypes that are common, in people that have, let's say type 2 diabetes, or is it that have those not been identified yet?
In terms of how the sugar behaves, you mean?
Are there archetypes like, there's 3 types of sugar response, and these people do this and these do that, and that kind of stuff?
Right. Yeah, there are. So let's talk about the type 1 diabetes. So just a bit of an insight into the epidemiology. At the moment, we have around up to 500 million people who have diabetes worldwide, but say more than 90% do have the so-called type 2 diabetes. 1 or 2% might be the monogenic diabetes, and say the rest is the type 1 diabetes, so 8-9%. So if I start with, say, the commonest one, the type 2 diabetes, which is linked with the so-called insulin resistance or decreased sensitivity to insulin, and is linked with obesity and other cardiovascular diseases, or you say arterial hypertension or dyslipidemia, then in that situation, what we usually observe is that these people have preserved secretion of their insulin. So in fact, they have too much insulin. It's just not working properly due to the reasons I mentioned. And if you put CGM on those people, they would tend to have slightly elevated fasting blood glucose readings, and the excursions of blood glucose when they take a meal would not be so pronounced as compared, say, for example, to people who have type 1 diabetes. Because those who have type 1 diabetes, they have a complete insulin deficiency. Their body just doesn't produce there is no production of insulin whatsoever, clinically meaningful, And therefore, if somebody's undiagnosed and has type 1 diabetes, the blood sugar level might be very high all the time. But then when you start treating them with insulin, these blood glucose profiles tend to react more to what type of insulin you've given them, because they just depend on the insulin you're giving. Whereas the type 2 diabetes people, there's a bit of an insulin resistance, and that can be managed, as with tablets and other medications. So there are some, features or types of CGM traces in those 2 types of diabetes. Yeah. But eventually, some people with type 2 diabetes then go into what we call the insulin deficiency. Their pancreas gets so too tired, I would say, and just can't produce any insulin anymore. And these people might then also need insulin, just like those with type 1 diabetes.
Okay. Has there ever been an attempt to really finely control people's sugar responses to see how finely you can control them?
That's right. So the holy grail might be the so-called artificial pancreas. I'm sure you heard about this, which would be a completely closed loop system, in a way where the insulin will be administered via the insulin pump, but the dosing of the insulin would be managed by an algorithm, and that will be influenced, of course, by the actual sugar levels. And this is already happening. We have seen some great advances in the technology in the last decade. But as I mentioned before, the key, say, blocking element to achieve that is that we just don't have fast enough insulins to put into that pump that would be able precisely and timely act on the actual sugar levels. So we have the faster ever insulins, like, for example, the Fiasp or the Lumjev, the second generation fast-acting insulins. Those are perhaps nearing to that profile you would get in a healthy person in terms of how quickly they start acting. But then still, they are in a subcutaneous tissue and they are there for a couple of hours. So that's a bit different to what I've been describing in how our pancreas works when we don't have diabetes.
Well, yeah, I guess there are maybe better feedback mechanisms or, different mixtures or, all kinds of stuff. How good is our native pancreas at controlling our sugar levels in our body, in a healthy person?
In fact, very good, very good. And the reason is that as I mentioned before, the glucose is the obligatory fuel for our brain. And the brain just doesn't have any storage capacities for glucose. So you need a very tightly controlled mechanisms so that the brain function doesn't get somehow interrupted or doesn't get put into danger by too high, say more too low sugar levels. So our pancreas is very good in controlling blood sugar levels in the state of fasting and also in the state, so-called the postprandial state. That means after the ingestion of a meal. And it's a very tightly and precisely regulated system, which keeps the sugar within a reasonably narrow range, really.
Well, have you studied healthy people and people all on the continuum of diabetes? Like, what's the first loss of regulatory control? Does it happen during sleep? Does it happen during stress? Longitudinally, like, has anyone looked at this?
Sorry, you mean in terms of blood glucose?
Like, okay, so if I start off and I'm healthy, will I have any hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic events? And as I start down the road towards, getting sicker and sicker and more towards diabetes, what's going to be some of the first things that'll happen? Has anyone identified that? Like, will nighttime be the initial time when you start to see like hypo or hyper events, or is it during times of stress, or what's the first to go in terms of regulatory capacity?
So in general, hypoglycemia is not much common in people who do not have diabetes or people who don't have diabetes and take insulin or the so-called sulfonylureas or other medications. So hypoglycemia, which is really relevant for the doctors, is very, very extremely rare rather in people who don't have diabetes, much more rarer than the actual diabetes. So if you are on the path, say, if you are in the danger of getting type 1 diabetes, start with a more dramatic course, then what happens in the pancreas is that there is an autoimmune process which gradually destroys all the cells that produce insulin. But the pancreas has a lot of sort of cells which are there, the beta cells, and only when you lose approximately 70-80% of the cells, then you start getting symptoms because your sugar levels go up. And these symptoms will be the classic ones. You will get thirsty, you will need to drink a lot, you will need to pass a lot of urine, you might get tired, you might lose some weight, in fact. And these are indeed very unpleasant symptoms, which then lead to reasonably quick diagnosis, mostly in type 1. In type 2, the process is more lengthy and is not so dramatic. So people who have type 2 diabetes might just have a bit of a increased blood sugar levels, when they wake up or after the meals, and then might not notice that for quite a long time indeed. So for a couple of years, their diabetes might get unnoticed. And the first thing they might notice is a complication of diabetes, say, for example, a myocardial infarction or other things, really. So it's a bit different in type 2 and type 1.
Okay. What do you think is going to be the future of, blood sugar control and stopping hypo or hyper events? Like, what's coming out either in your research or in the next couple of years? What's your feeling?
Yeah. So in my own research, we trying to identify those people who are in particular danger of these dangerous consequences of hypoglycemia. If you want these kind of cardiac arrhythmias, sudden cardiac death, etc. And we've been trying to identify those people by various measures, but so far we have not been able to reliably say who out of these lot of people is in particular danger of that. But to answer perhaps your question in terms of what's the future in general, I think people starting to appreciate the problem of hypoglycemia in a bit of a broader aspect. So we know that the hypoglycemia is bad to the cardiovascular health. It can lead to various pathologies, and therefore people who manage diabetes, the clinician or the diabetes nurses, are perhaps going to pay a bit more attention to the fact that it's not only the high readings which are dangerous, it's also the low readings which are dangerous. And you have all the wonderful technology here, but also let's not forget about the education, which is sometimes a bit missed in terms of place in the management of diabetes. We have some wonderful data also from the UK and all over the world that education is very good, in fact, in preventing hypos happening and in improving the glycemic control overall. So I think it's going to be very exciting, and we'll see a mixture of novel technologies coming in. We'll see a mixture of novel insulins and treatments coming in, and we have now some novel medications for type 2 diabetes, which don't tend to cause a lot of hypos, really. So I think we gradually getting there, and the clinical problem of hypoglycemia is being paid attention to.
Okay, very good. Well, Peter, what's the best way for people to find out about your particular research? Where can they go?
So, I'm in a bit of a transition period. I moved from the UK to Slovakia, and I do some research at the Institute for Clinical and Experimental Medicine in Prague, which is in Czech Republic. So at the moment, the best way of contacting me is to email me on my email address, and I do also have a Facebook account. But I think the best way of contacting me would be through the email.
Okay, very good. Well, Peter, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.